Hello, everyone. So welcome to my YouTube channel if you're here for the first time. And this is just a reminder that I am recording a series of videos as part of a position I have started as a poetry reviewer for the Poetry Foundation's new literary blog called Harriet, after Harriet Monroe, the famous American editor of Poetry magazine. And I'll link to everything that I discussed in this video below. The first review that I presented as part of this series was the review of the Yemeni American poet Threya Almontasir's book, The Wild Fox of Yemen. So I'm creating video reviews and to accompany written reviews, which I'll also link to. And then the second review video that I created was for American poet Nathaniel Tarn's The Holder Linai, a poem. This is a kind of homage to the German romantic poet Friedrich Hölderlin. And the third video in this series is of a book called Damascus, Atlantis, Selected Poems. These are translations from the Swedish of poet Marie Silkeberg, and the translator is Kelsey Vonada. So I'm very excited to be reviewing what is perhaps my deepest love as a creator and a reader, which is poetry in translation. And this book also is very close to my heart because I lived in Damascus. As you see, the title is Damascus, Atlantis. So part of it's about Damascus, although not all of it. And it is set, many of the poems are set during the Syrian War. And I lived in Damascus right before the war started. I left in August of 2010. So, and then I moved to Berlin and I watched the destruction that was visited on that country with a very aching heart and concern about all of my friends there and their fates. And so the poem is very involved with, or the poems in this book are very involved with that event. But it's also it's very innovative in many, many respects, both the translation and the original Swedish. And this book also raises a number of questions for me as someone who is now mostly translating in collaboration with Keyvan Tahmasibyan. He's an Iranian poet. And so most of the translations that I publish these days are co-authored, not just under my own name. And I made that decision after comparing the two experiences, the experience of translating poetry, in particular poetry, by myself as compared to translating it with someone else. And I've written about this. I'll link to that article that I co-authored with Keyvan below. It's really the experience of co-translation in particular has really made me decide that it's so different from translating alone, and it's so much superior to translating alone just as an experience. All of the kind of frustrations that come with translating alone many of them at least are temporarily overcome when one works with another. And so the reason why I'm talking about this now is because although you see here author Marie Silkeberg, so these poems are by a Swedish poet. Marie Silkeberg is also, as we learn while reading this book, and particularly you can see from the table of contents, there's a essay by the translator Kelsey Vonada called "Desire is Also a Question," translating Marie Silkeberg's poetry, and then also an afterword by a Swedish scholar called Marie Silkeberg's Micro-Universes. As we realize, as we become immersed into these poems from that material and elsewhere, is that some of the poems were produced in collaboration, or perhaps this is all very, very delicate here, how I describe this. There was an association with a Syrian Palestinian poet named Ghayath Almadhoun for poems in this book that were published in Swedish originally. And the Swedish title of that book was Till Damascus. I think it's a reference to Damascus. It's a reference to a play by Strindberg. Anyways, what I'm saying is that, so this is a translation of two Swedish books, Till Damascus, which is co-authored with a Syrian Palestinian poet named Ghayath Almadhoun, and of Atlantis, which is solely authored by Marie Silkeberg. So you might wonder, where's the other poet's name on this cover, right? So again, to clarify, the book Till Damascus, which is a Swedish title and is, let's say, one half of this book in English, that, although it is co-authored with Ghayath Almadhoun, I checked with the publishers and they explained that the poems that are solely by Marie Silkeberg are the ones in that co-authored book are the ones that are translated here. In other words, the position of the publishers is that none of the work that Marie Silkeberg and Ghayath Almadhoun published together has been translated here, and hence his name is absent. But as someone who is a co-translator and also a co-author, that just really made me think about my own experience of co-authoring and co-translating. And I asked myself, does that make any sense? I mean, in any co-authored book, actually, let me show you the book that I'm talking about. Yes, so this is my most recent, there are more forthcoming, but this is my most recent co-authored poetry and translation with Keyvan Tahmassebian. Both of our names are on the cover. Of course, in many cases, actually, Keyvan was the one who produced the first draft, and we discussed it, we changed things together. But then there are some cases, perhaps, where I tried to draft something first, or where I initiated some of the headnotes and footnotes and commentary, but he also made substantial input. And the whole idea of separating that out, in other words, of saying like, okay, here's the 50% that's Keyvan's, here's the 50% that's mine, or here's the 80% that's Keyvan's and 20% that's mine, it's very alien to my experience of the creative process. So I really struggle with the idea that there are two co-authors to a book, the Swedish book I'm talking about, Till Damascus, and that somehow you can just extract what the Swedish poet contributed and then not mention the Syrian Palestinian poet as a co-author, if he was originally a co-author in the Swedish version. I'm not suggesting anyone did anything wrong. I'm just suggesting that it feels very weird to me, and it makes me really think about the nature of co-authorship, and even ask, why is it that it was the Syrian Palestinian poet whose voice was excluded when this is a book about Damascus, and there's a Swedish poet involved, but some of us are really interested in knowing more about Arab voices and Syrian voices. And so it was just interesting. And then another thing making this even more complicated is that it's a great book. I'll discuss it in more detail shortly. But as you can see, flipping through the book, there are lots of images, right? These images, and I'll link to these below. They are taken from a series of what are called in the book poem videos that were created, or poem films, I believe, that were created, that are a combination of text and image. So there are scenes from the Syrian War spliced with poetry that is translated here. And that together, that multimedia production makes a poem film. And you can find some of those on YouTube, and I'll link to them. And these are co-authored creations, again, with Marie Silkeberg and Ghayath Almadhoun. So just to have the author here as Marie Silkeberg makes me wonder about how publishers make decisions about who's going to be highlighted, how translators make decisions, and why does the publishing industry have such a problem with co-authorship? Why can't we recognize the collective nature of co-authorship and co-creation, and recognize that that's actually probably the norm, for many contexts in many cultures, and yet there's a certain tendency to really highlight the author as if that's the sole source of where we should be looking when we attribute agency to a book. And particularly, I would add here, because Marie Silkeberg herself says in her interviews, she doesn't know Arabic. She is not, I think she's never been to Damascus. So she's not deeply familiar with this context or culture, which isn't a requirement for poetry. But in a book which I'll discuss shortly, that is interrogating colonialism, interrogating distributions of power and unjust wars. It just made me think about how those power structures continue to shape how we receive certain works. And I should also add that Ghayath Almadhoun's poetry has been translated into English, and it is published. I'll link to that as well. I haven't had a chance to review it yet, but so it's just in this particular book that I've been involved with. So leaving all that aside, I had to get that off my chest because, again, I am a co-author, I'm a co-translator, and I've noticed that it can be difficult to get publishers and editors to really recognize that co-translation is a totally normal and legitimate way of producing work. And what it means is that you don't have one dominant person there, and you can't just say correspond with one of the authors and assume that, you know, they speak as that it's all the same. You really need to think of dual authorship or multiple, or even, you know, in bigger scale as well. So leaving all that aside, I'll just discuss these poems, which are quite interesting. Some of them are a bit challenging. There's a lot of prose poetry you can see here that's written in a kind of stream of consciousness style. I personally really like the poems that were written in more traditional stanzaic form. Like, for example, these. And I was really intrigued by the juxtaposition of sound and image, of word and image, and the way that I do think that this is a beautifully produced book. The book itself is very, very pleasant to read. The cover is pretty amazing. Again, cover, which I think should be, the images themselves are part of a poem film that's attributed to both Marie Silkeberg and Ghayath Almadhoun. So I really think in that context, we should think about dual authorship as well. But it's quite, if you want to at least vicariously imagine yourself experiencing the consequences of the Syrian War, I do recommend reading it. And here's just an excerpt from one of the poems, which is called Abu Dhabi Rub al-Hali. That's referring to a certain neighborhood. Rub al-Hali, I mean, it's referring to a neighborhood in let me just show you the title there, in Abu Dhabi, called the Empty Quarter. And it's the poem itself is comprised of conversations that the poet has while she's traveling through various places, sometimes on airplanes. But here it looks like it's sometimes in hotel rooms. This looks like a street conversation, perhaps, or maybe a conversation in a hotel. A feeling of danger wakes you. Take me with you, you say. No, he says, it's hot. I'll be searching for a place for a long time. You keep swimming until you see him leave. The tall buildings. Oil is the answer to almost every question. Qatar is only gas. Everything is gas in the white light. There's no light in the desert, he says. I'm totally dark now. It's totally dark now. When there's no moon, we wouldn't see anything. We won't get to the desert, you think. Trust me, he says. No, you answer. Is it sexy? You ask about belly dancing. I don't know, he answers. The line that really struck me there is oil is the answer to almost every question. So it's interesting because I think that the kind of political, I like the political dimensions of this work. And I think that the critiques of colonial past, of contemporary geopolitics, of why there is a war in Syria in the first place, and why the world just kind of watched passively as millions and millions and millions of people were displaced. These questions are really foregrounded in this book, and they're good. And then the later poems in this collection, which are not set in Damascus or not about Damascus, list a series of locations. There's a poem called De Ville de Sea, Leopoldville, which is a colonial outpost in the Congo. And here the poet kind of travels through. She starts in a train in Leopoldville, but of course I'm not suggesting that this actually happened. It's her imagination, perhaps, in which she's having these conversations with colonized people, with people about colonialism, with historical legacies. And there's a particularly memorable moment when she is wandering through the city in, I think it's Brussels, And you can see here the juxtaposition of a building that is falling apart, which I take that to be from the Syrian War. So you have this sort of wartime violence, but she's wandering through a European city, meets tourists, and she says, I think for some reason I'm thinking it's the museum to, is it colonialism, or the museum that in which King Leopold is honored in Belgium. I know there's been a source of controversy around that museum recently, and because of course he's responsible for a major genocide that took place during his period, in which I believe he was implicated in. So I'll just read an excerpt from this poem from Leopoldville. The Flemish couple explains bells that chiming for 4 hours tell you about the name, the thrown hand, Antwerp, in remembrance of someone who cut off his head after slaughtering many people for some god or ruler, and stopped by cutting his own hand off, and now stands erect as a statue in the square. If it's collective memory or collective amnesia, you wonder. 10 million hands, mutilations in the colonies. You look at the facade of the newly built historical museum, a small silver hand in each rust-red stone. So those are two poems that I think give you a sense of the flavor of this book, which I think is extremely important. I somewhat regret having spent so much time sort of asking questions about the conditions of its production, and the perhaps missing or absent or co-author whose name I would have been nice to see occur more frequently in the book. But I recommend buying it. It's going to be released in mid-May, so next week, and check it out. And also, if you're interested in hearing more video reviews of books that I'll be reviewing in the upcoming weeks and months, consider subscribing. Thanks.